I will begin, if you allow me, to speak by recognizing that I'm speaking from New York City. So that's where I'm connecting from. A city which sits on the unseized land of the Lenni Lenape nations, with continued presence and struggles in this land. I would like to acknowledge, beginning perhaps by calling this city through their own name and term, Lenape Hokin. I am a philosopher, and I thought my contribution to this workshop could be doing what philosophers do, that is, try to provide some conceptual clarifications as to the terms that we are using. And in particular, we'll focus on the notion of the imagination, which in my view, when tackled from the contemporary point of view, is intrinsically linked to two other concepts, what I call the imaginary, which is very often associated with imagination, and another concept that I call the imaginal, which is much less known, but that I will try to argue as many promising things for us. Okay, so to begin with, a quotation from Richard Rorty, who says, "Interestingly, philosophy is rarely an examination of the pros and cons of a thesis. Usually it is implicitly or explicitly a context between an entrenched vocabulary, which has become a nuisance, and a half-formed new vocabulary, which vaguely promises many great things," unquote. Now, drawing inspiration from this passage from Rorty, I would like to explore in the 30 minutes that have been assigned to me the context that has been generated around the language of the imagination. In particular, I'd like to point to the contrast between these two terms, imagination and imaginary, and try to argue that within this context, the concept of imaginal actually can open as a fruitful way forward. So to begin with, imagination. Now, what do we say when we say imagination, and how do we use this term in common language? I'm here mainly referring to the English term and the sort of conceptual assumption that are linked to the concept of imagination as they're used today. When we say this is the fruit of your imagination, we are more or less implicitly assuming that imagination is the faculty to represent what is not there, which can be an hallucination, the bad imagination, or the projection of a utopian world to come. In any case, it's intrinsically associated with something that is not there. Now, my question is this a helpful way to understand imagination, or has this language become a nuisance, an entrenched vocabulary that still persists, but nevertheless can be more of a problem than a solution? Now, if we look at the genealogy of the concept of imagination as it's usually represented within the Western philosophical canon, we can see that there are at least two crucial breaks in this genealogy. The first is encapsulated in the passage from the ancient Greek term fantasia to the Latin term imaginatio, and then the English term imagination. Now, the term fantasia in ancient Greek, at least in its early phases, denotes the faculty to produce images in the most general sense of the term, and is not systematically associated with the idea of the absence of what is represented. For instance, Aristotle, who famously argued that whenever we think, we do so along with an image, at times uses the term fantasia to denote what we would call true vision. For instance, in a passage from De Cielo, while discussing the nature of the stars, and the earth, he points out to our fantasia of it, precisely to say to what we actually see, and therefore to dissipate falsity. Now, clearly that passage cannot be translated with our corresponding term fantasy, because then we would lose its meaning. The question, therefore, for us is, what lies at the origin of this gap, even from Aristotle's text, and why can't we simply translate that passage with our corresponding terms? I cannot go too much into the detail of this genealogical reconstruction here. I can say more later if you're interested. But what I would like to point is, for the time being, this first passage from Fantasia as the faculty to produce images in the most general sense of the term, to what we could call modern fantasy. Indeed, it is in modern times, after the 17th century great critique of imagination as a sort of perturbation of the methodical work of reason, that the terms fantasia and imaginatio and their modern derivations start to be systematically associated with the representation of what is not there, and consequently also with the newly born sphere of aesthetics. Aesthetics is a typically modern invention. However, to associate imagination with the absence of the object of representation, or even with the unreal, means assuming from the very beginning what is real and what is not real. Again, here we have another tension. Is imagination something that is necessarily unreal? Is it the sign of a presence or of an absence? If it is the faculty to produce images, then these images are real, at least transmit something about the reality of the subject that is producing them. Okay, so this is very quickly, I don't have much time, broadly speaking, brief reconstruction of the history of the imagination. It's genealogy, if you want, at least as it comes out from the Western philosophical tradition. More recently, critics of imagination, understood as an individual faculty, have proposed to leave the concept of imagination aside and move towards a theory of the imaginary. So there's been this shift from imagination to the imaginary, a shift that we can see in disciplines as different as sociology, history, and philosophy, psychology in particular, psychoanalysis, and I can say more about that later on. Broadly speaking, we can say that whereas the concept of imagination tends to be understood as an individual faculty, the concept of the imaginary rather points to the social context. As a relatively new term derived from the substantivized adjective, the concept of the imaginary as a function of underlying that humans are always born within certain imaginary significations, and that, as psychoanalysis, among other disciplines, has shown, our socialization as human beings depend on our capacity to abandon our primigenial object of libidinal investment in favor of socially recognized imaginary significations. So this morning we raised the question, how can we imagine together? I think for a lot of psychoanalysts working in the tradition, or even sociologists working in the tradition of social imaginaries, the question is how we can actually think alone and imagine alone. If it's true that our imagining is always mediated, to begin with, mediated by language. Language is intrinsically social, and through language from very early on, as well as through images, we all internalize certain imaginary significations that somehow become constitutive of our being. So if we begin with imagination, then we end with the question raised this morning, how can we imagine together? But if we begin with the social imaginaries as a category, then we end up with the opposite question, which is, how can we imagine alone? That is, how can we be sure that the fruit of our imagination is not just the deposit of centuries of certifications of imaginary significations as deposited in language, myth, symbols that we have become accustomed to. Now, indeed, history, I think, has shown that even within very oppressive imaginary, there is always the possibility for the free imagination of individuals to emerge and to develop. Furthermore, philosophers have criticized the concept of imagination as an individual faculty, emphasizing how it presupposes a Western modern understanding of the subject as an individual separated from the rest of the community, and they have therefore emphasized the need indeed to point not only or not primarily on imagination as an individual faculty, but much more than that on the social significations. This morning, Castoriadis was mentioned, and certainly the philosopher who I think has most systematically emphasized the importance of keeping together theories of imagination with the theories of the imaginary. Now, in the last 10 years, when I started to work on imagination more than 20 years ago, the concept of imaginary was mainly used in the singular. Now, more and more, we see it used in the plural. So there is the social imaginaries, which somehow have been at times combined the idea of civilization. So every civilization has its imaginary. There is the modern imaginary. There is the ancient imaginary. You can see how the concept of imaginaries in the plural has become a shortcut for social context or even civilizational or national context. The problem that I see here is that if we want to abandon the concept of imagination because it embodies a problematic philosophy of the subject, then by jumping into theories of social imaginaries in the plural, we may just end up replicating the same sort of methodological individualism, but on a larger scale. So we want to escape problematic Western philosophy of the subject, and we end up in what I think is an equally problematic metaphysics of the context, as if the context, the social context, were this all-encompassing and homogeneous whole that determines the way in which we imagine together. Moreover, and here perhaps is the most philosophical part of my work, which I don't know how interesting it is to this audience, and you can ask more later if you're interested. When I wrote the book Imaginal Politics, I had this impression that this tension was caught into a false alternative, because whether we're talking about single individual human beings or single individual social contexts, nations or civilizations, we're still talking about individualities. What we think is an alternative between the individual and the social is actually reproducing the same sort of methodological individualism, that is the same sort of philosophical approach where we take individualities as something that is given and that we study because they are given as such. More recently, I've been working following Gilbert Simondon and Balibar reading of Spinoza's ontology. That's my other side, the more ontological and philosophical reflection. They've been elaborating what they called a philosophy of trans-individuality. Now, what is this philosophy of trans-individuality? Is a form of philosophy that argues precisely against this form of methodological individualism, that the main philosophical problem should not be how we relate different individuals together, but rather how individuals come into being in the first place. And so the philosophical shift is from how we think the relationship between the individual and the social. The philosophical shift is to how we think the coming into being of the individual and of the social as two separate fields. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so it seemed to me, in particular, by looking at the state of the art of the debate within not just philosophy, but also the social sciences in general, that the debate was stuck in this kind of dilemma. If one started with imagination conceived as an individual faculty, then the problem is how to account for the decisive role of social context in shaping individual imagination. But if we begin with the concept of social imaginary or social imaginaries in the plural, then the problem is how to reconcile it with the free imagination. So the problem seems unsolvable, and for me, the fact that even the most insightful philosophers of the imagination, such as Cornelius Castoriadis, remain stuck in the opposition between these two terms, signals that there is no way out of this alternative. Now, while digging more into the genealogy of the term imagination, I came across this concept, the imaginal, okay? The imaginal, which may sound, following Rorty's initial passage, as something new, maybe even half-formed vocabulary. Certainly, there are not as many books on the imaginal as there are on imagination, if you just Google the term. But nevertheless, is a concept that, in my view, is particularly helpful precisely to point to this tension between imagination and imaginary, but also begin a new strand of research on what we can call the capacity of imagining, which in my view is always both individual and social at the same time. And how does this happen? Because imaginal simply means what is made of images, and as such, it does not make any ontological presupposition as to whether the subject producing images is an individual or a collectivity. So instead of focusing on the subject producing images, we focus on images themselves. Now, I should also say that I took the concept originally from the work of Cinzia Fleury, who in turn derived it from Henri Corbin, who studied, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. Corbin is a French philosopher who studied the Iranian and Muslim philosophical traditions, and actually took the concept of imaginal from the concept of al-alm al-mital, Sohrawardi, and the Muslim and the Sufi tradition. But then, interestingly enough, also showed how this concept fluctuated even inside of the Western world through the notion of a mundus imaginalis. And I think it's important to mention this because we are used, and I mean, at the beginning of my work on the concept of imagination, all the contributions coming from Arab thinkers, because I don't speak Arabic and so I don't read Arabic sources, I thought that I could not access them and they would not be available to me. I could not read the original work in Henri Corbin. And then I realized that actually at the time, so we're talking about the High Middle Ages, A lot of these intellectuals were fluent in multiple languages, Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew quite often. And for them, the circulation of ideas, so all of these different genealogies of imagination, Eastern, Western, of course, well before the idea of a Western civilization was invented, was actually their daily bread. And so I had to do a lot of work myself, given my limited, what I thought were my limited linguistic possibility to dig out this concept from the history and the genealogy of the term of imagination. And then I realized that actually, although it originally came from the Arabic term alarm al-metal, but it was circulating in translation as mundus imaginalis, which means the imaginal world, for a very long time, even within the West. But as it often happens, and in particular, given the Eurocentrism that dominates the Western academy, when concepts that had been marginalized are brought back into the discussion at the beginning, they appear as not as solid, not as serious, although Enrico Urban, who made perhaps the most important translation of this work, is given to the term imaginal both a philosophical, a theological, and I think a quite rigorous phenomenological treatment. Okay, so this is for a little footnote on the genealogy of the imaginal. Now, why is that, if you want, alternative genealogy, rescuing of this concept any relevant for us today? Because I think that with this focus on the imaginal, we can overcome the dilemmas that I mentioned before. And we can do it, if you want, by embarking on a sort of double Copernican revolution. So beyond the philosophy of the subject, so imagination as an individual faculty, but also beyond what I think is an equally problematic metaphysics of the context, so the imaginary as a given social context. So the starting point is neither a subject separated from the world, nor a world separated from the subject, but simply images. And the reason why this is a better starting point is, in my view, easy to understand. Without images, there cannot be a world for us. But this does not mean that we have to decide a priori what is the source of this process of imagining, whether individual or social. Having studied these issues for more than 20 years, I am now persuaded that in our capacity to imagine is always both social and individual at the same time. But I think the advantage of the concept of imaginal is also that it enables us to distinguish when it is more social from when it is more of the result of an individual mind. And I think that when you do social research, this is a big advantage. Okay, notice also here that images understood, and that's the definition, tentative definition that I provide of images, as representations, they can also be presences in themselves, enjoy a primacy vis-a-vis language and argumentative thinking. I mean, Aristotle is right. Whenever we think along with images. There are always images deposited in our language, but it's also true that images emerge before language and that they contain a surplus of meaning that cannot be fully rendered at times through linguistic descriptions, and that, more importantly, also can go beyond linguistic barriers, okay? Just as an example for our digital age, think of how the Mohammed cartoon affairs sparked so quickly by circulating on the media, how they sparked such a huge debate and violent reactions. A political, if instead of being an image, a political cartoon, it had been a statement written in a Danish newspaper in a language that notoriously very few people can speak, it would never have had the impact that it had. So images have this specificity, I believe, which draws also on its capacity to coagulate affects in an immediate way. Words can do that too, but I think that images do it in a very different way. And I believe that this is the specific force of the imaginal. It's primordial because it's given with the psyche itself. Indeed, what is the psyche, if not and foremost, a stream of images that constantly express itself? So we have our conscious thinking that takes place through words, but we also have this psyche that is much larger than just our conscious thinking. That takes place as a constant stream of images that arrives with us even before we start speaking as humans. Okay, so what are the advantages of this concept of the imaginal? First, it helps us overcome the tension between the social and the individual. Secondly, since in contrast to the term imaginary, which is usually associated with the idea of unreality of content, the term imaginal simply means what is made of images. And so the very term that it comes from, mundus imaginalis, denotes a world that is both real and unreal, or I would say even better, is a world for which we do not assume any pre-given definition of what is real and what is not. Why is that a better starting point? Well, because the definition of what is real changes, and we've seen it throughout history, change radically from one context to the other. Just to give an example, as I am Italian and I've been educated within Christianity, in Christian theology, the ens realissimus, the most real being, is God. And that is a view that if I try to explain to an atheist, we just can never agree as to what it means that God is the most real being. But that is a view of reality which actually dominated for at least an entire millennia in Europe. Okay, so I don't have that much time left, but I just want to see, so if this is the imaginal, what role does it play in politics? As is well known, there's as many definitions of politics as one may want. We can even say that every good political theorist provided a different definition of politics. But let's say if we take politics, even in what I think is the broadest possible meaning of the term, politics are understood as whatever concerns the life of the polis, right? The public life. We can very well see why politics depends on the imaginal, because you need an image of the public in order to make the public exist. Besides, without the mediating capacity of images, what is a public is just a scattered set of bodies and territories and people. You need the synthetic power of images to have a public emerge out of what is otherwise a chaotic flux of sensations, feelings, and discourses. Now, perhaps one can say at this point, okay, if we consider that without images, there will not be any world for us, which is, I think, the main intuition behind the notion of a mundus imaginalis, then it's a banality to say that there cannot be politics without the imaginal. The question then, at least for me, became, okay, why writing a book called Imaginal Politics if politics has always been imaginal, and why do we need to tackle this question now? Okay, two main reasons, which actually were the reasons why I started to be interested in this topic. The first is that I think we are assisting to a change in the nature of the imaginal and in the nature of images that is both quantitative and qualitative. And to quote Hegel, a German philosopher, quantitative changes at some point generate a new quality. And I think that what we are assisting to in terms of our political landscape is precisely the emergence of a new quality of political life. Why do I say so? Well, because think for a moment just the sheer increase in the number of images that mediate our doing politics. Not saying that politics in pre-modern times was great. There has always been the mediating power of images, but for instance, during the Middle Ages, most lay people had very little visual contact with their leaders. And whenever the leaders appears was always in an exceptional circumstances, which generated the particular types of feelings. Now, images of our leaders are constantly on the screen. Now they're even constantly on our iPhone. They're constantly with us. How is this just sheer increase in the quantity of images changing our political life? The answer that I try to provide in the book Imaginal Politics is that, as often the case, when you have an insane amount of images and too many images, what happens is that there is a competition between them, and the winner in the competition is most often the image that can capture enough affective reactions to keep you glued to the screen. So the sheer increase in the quantity of images pushes for notorious phenomena such as the spectacularization of political life. So the turning of political engagements into something that is more and more spectacular. And we can talk about that later on. But this quantitative change also goes hand in hand with what I think is an intrinsically qualitative change in the phenomenology of images. What happens when images become virtual is that we experience them in different ways. First of all, this pushes us to revise our notion of not just reality and unreality, because the virtual risks now being the most real, but also to relate in different ways to question of truth. So phenomena such as the emergence of post-truth politics, fake news, are all, in my view, intrinsically linked to this transformation of what we can call the imaginal politics of our time. I know that there are commentators to my talk, and I think that's 30 minutes, so I'll leave the discussion here, and yes, we can talk more later on. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Chiara. Now we have Miri. Miri, I'm so grateful for you that you agreed to join us today. I think that we are engaging in a conversation for quite some time, you and me, about imagination. So you were the first person that I thought would be great to speak here. Dr. Miri Rozmarin is a senior lecturer in the Gender Studies program at Tel University. She is also a senior research fellow and the head of the research lab, Contemporary Feminist Political Subjectivity at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. Her research interests include different aspects of social transformation, such as temporality, vulnerability, and affects as elements of political lives. Her first book, titled Creating Oneself, that was published in 2011, addresses the question of agency in a post-liberal philosophy. Her second book, Vulnerable Futures, Transformative Pasts on Vulnerability, Temporality, and Ethics, appeared in 2017, addresses vulnerability as a characteristic of social life. Her present research, which is funded by the Israeli Science Foundation, theorizes vulnerability as the basis for contemporary political subjectivities. Miri, please.
Thank you, Norma. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Chiara, for this wonderful talk. It was an opportunity to just go into your work, and it was a great experience. So in my response, I would like to sketch an account of imaginal political subjects as it stems from Professor Boticci's theory of the imaginal. I then suggest that this account of political subject can yield a promising theorization of critique, which can encounter some of contemporary challenges that face feminist and other critical political subjects. The concept of political subjectivity draws on critical political theories which conceptualize in different ways the mutual production of subjectivity and power formations. Hence, this category draws attention to the social practices, desires, and affects through which people become subject, and how this position opens for them a range of possibilities to transform this power formation that govern the subjectivity. I would like to suggest that Professor Boticci's theory adds a crucial aspect to our understanding of political subjectivity. People become political subject not only through practices, desires, and affects, but also through multiple relations with the imaginal. Boticci stresses that the imaginal differs from the traditional view of the imaginal, the imagination as a faculty of individuals, as well as from the notion of the imaginary as a deep-seated social modes of interpretation and understanding. Drawing on Castoriadis and Arendt, Boticci argues that although certain images constitute the subject, people can change the meanings and images and create new ones. The imaginal then is open for reproducing, representing, or just creating new images, which may support and produce new ways to live in the world. The relations with the imaginal are context dependent and may stem from collective or individual social experiences. As such, they vary depending on social location. Thus, as constitutive part of political subject, we may say that there is no single structure of imaginal political subject. Instead, new position of imaginal political subjectivities can emerge through engaging with images and imaginal spaces. Boticci aims to go beyond the monadic metaphysics of Castoriadis and stresses that imaginal subjectivity is relational. This relationality stems in her earlier formulation from the fundamental fact that we are, from the very beginning, dependent beings. This was a quote. In her later paper, she follows Balibar and Spinoza, stressing the transhumanistic account of this relationality, which focuses on the dynamic interconnections between bodies. The imaginal is also immanently social. Boticci argues that the imaginal constitutes the sociality of the subject and her ability to be part of politics in at least three ways. Following Arendt, Boticci argues that action as the capacity to begin something new and change facts depend on our capacity to imagine that things might be different from what they actually are. Secondly, it is only by imagining that one can relate to a community, and thus the imaginal shape people's sense of belonging. Thirdly, Boticci notes that the imaginals is also crucial for processes of political transformation because it can mobilize emotions and sympathies. Focuses on political subject, we could say that these three aspects, imagining an alternative reality, the mobilization of emotions, and the sense of belonging, shape the ways political subjects engage with their reality. Thus, the imaginary resources that communities and individuals have and the accessibility to positions of producing new images are crucial for political life. Boticci's theory invites us to think about political subjects as complex web of relations with images. In the next few minutes, I would like to think with this conceptual framework about the challenges facing feminist critical theory. I will look at the image of political subject that govern critical feminist theory and briefly suggest that the theory of the imaginal that Boticci introduces can join other feminist social ontologies as the basis for new image of critique and therefore new feminist political subject. The imaginal can be, my son is interrupting me right now, go away. Go, sorry. He's just standing there and waving. It's very good for people with okay, so the imaginal can be and often is part of critique. Boticci follows Castoriadis in arguing that because imagination can always potentially question its own product, it can therefore be means of critique. Yet Castoriadis holds an individualistic account of critique. And as I mentioned, Boticci's account of the imaginal subject stresses its relationality and sociality. So if we think of critique as part of political life, how does the social ontology of the imaginal subject shape our understanding of what critique is? Critique as formulated by the Frankfurt School aims to disrupt and negate the internal consistency of ideological mechanisms. It was Adorno who stressed, perhaps more than others, that from this commitment to it also follows that critique should take its own subject as an object of questioning. In the process of critique, any coherent identity must be denied, including the reason that governs the critical process. In a more recent formulation, Lee Edelman and Laurent Berlant argue that, and I quote, negativity signifies a resistance to or undoing of the stabilizing frameworks of coherence imposed on thought and lived experiences, end quote. No, sorry, it's not the end of the quote. As such, it is not a negation of the social, but an intrinsic part of it, which makes negativity a crucial resource for social theory, end quote. According to this image, any subject position is conditioned by power formation. In order to criticize these conditions, critique assumes the possibility of a radical separation of the critical subject from one's own everyday life, identity, and habitus. Thus, although this kind of negative critique is called immanent critique, it assumes that the subject of critique will not be part of the flow of effects which constitute social reality. Critique is immanent to the form of life that it criticizes only in the sense that it does not use external normative principles in relation to which reality is criticized. Instead, critiques aim to locate objective fractures and crises in the social reality itself. Moreover, for Adorno, because the object of critique is social relations as a whole, there is hardly any way to pose the idea or even imagine the radical alternative future that the critical act aims to realize. Although emancipation was the core goal of Frankfurt School, any affirmative statement concerning the vision of such an emancipated world could not be deduced from the negative dialectic without either failing the commitment to negativity and becoming a coherent context of deception, or instantly becoming an object of critique. This association of critique with negativity raised two related concerns. The first problem concerns the range of political affects that are available to political subjects committed to negative critique. Performing critique evokes estrangement, suspicion, and revolt as crucial political affects. If Cedric argued that critique has turned suspicion into an imperative for political action. Consequently, she argued, a wide range of other political affects is not considered as a source for interpretation and transformative knowledge. If we would take critique as a way of life, such a position is hardly bearable and a relational disaster. Another related concern focuses on the question of normativity of critique. There are very different formulations of the meaning of normativity and its relation to critique. The concern that I raise here stems mainly from the argument made by post-colonial and other post-Enlightenment branches of critical theory. That the very notion of emancipation and related concepts such as freedom, agency, or self-constitutions are ideological and privilege an image of the subject as a white Western secular man. Following this realization, should critique be strictly negative methodology? Can political life be based solely on critique as negative practice? And can critique affirm certain normative principles or goals in a non-dogmatic way? I would like to suggest that the notion of the imaginal political subject as relational, creative, and social has the potential of yielding a new notion of critique, which better conceptualizes critique as part of the political lives of actual subjects. Boticci theory of the imaginal subject stresses that imagining a different world is necessary for political subjectivities and thus for critique. She offers a way to think about the affirmative normative aspect of critique in ways that do not attribute to these normative horizons a status of pre-political principle. Instead, the normative horizon is an image of an alternative future that mobilizes the desire for transformation and integrates moments of disorientation, despair, and rage into a continual political life. The focus on the imaginal also clarifies that a sense of belonging to a place and a community is also necessary for critique and not its impediment. Boticci joined other influential feminist scholars such as Adriana Cavarero, Judith Butler, Lucy Rigarai, Rosie Braidotti, and others who used the philosophical mode of social ontology as a way to offer a normative and ethical vision of a better future that anchors the critique of the present. In time when feminist theory and critical theory fight for their legitimacy, and look for ways to face populist power for conservative images, we should offer new images of what critique is. I believe that integrating a sense of community and belonging, as well as creating a sharing, vivid and multifarious images of a better future can be an important step for facing contemporary challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miri. It was wonderful. Now I have a short response. Just a minute. So my name is Norma Musih, and I am a visual and digital culture researcher, also part of the Minerva Research Center. And my response has to do with what I research, that is images. In your book, Chiara, there is just one image on the cover. And I think that for me, it's interesting to, to follow your thinking as a philosopher. You came to think about images from the philosophy of them, and I came to think about the philosophy from the images. So my response comes from there. So in the book, Imaginal Politics, you trace a genealogy of the imagination, creating a triptych: imagination, imaginary, and imaginal. The imaginal appears in your theory as a way out of the dichotomy between imagination as a faculty we possess and the imaginary as a realm that possesses us. The imaginal suggests an answer. Imaginal means simply that which is made of images and can therefore be the product both of an individual faculty and the social context, as well as a complex interaction between the two. As you convincingly show, images are important for politics, and politics have always been imaginal, because we cannot think of politics without imagining a public and a claim to legitimacy. Politics depend on the imaginal because it is only by imagining it that the public comes into being. It's only by imagining that one can perceive a sense of belonging with strangers that we don't know. In order to perceive a polis, something that unifies all those scattered bodies, there is a need for a pictorial representation that can include all of them. Images are powerful. They appear within, but also before language. They generate affects and collective memories and a sense of community and citizenship, as Harriman and Lucates have shown, and they also always hold more, as Azoulay has shown in relation to photography. For Azoulay, photography is what takes place in and through an encounter among people, none of whom can ever dictate alone what will be recorded in the photograph. The photograph itself, as an object, can never establish the limits of this event, for one of the main characteristics of photography, and I think it is applicable also to other images as well, is their condition of plurality. What the image shows always accepts that which the creator of the image attempts to inscribe in it, because it is a story that is constantly being written. Moreover, the original attempt to establish what will be seen in the frame always leaves traces that can eventually reconstruct the complexity of the image. The indexicality of images is flexible. They not only show what was there, but what could have potentially been there, or maybe could be there in the future. Now, my question is this: how do we experience, consume, or digest the imaginal? If we assume that the imaginal is that which is made of images, what is the process that allows us to say this is an image of a flower? The answer would be we see them, either with the eyes of our body or with the eyes of our mind. Images in the Western tradition, you remind us, played an auxiliary role. They were an illustration for the literate. And maybe from this tradition, we assume that we know what we mean by seeing. The opposite is not seeing, right? Instead of reading, someone who cannot read can see. Seeing is the act of opening the eyes to encounter what is in front of them. It's almost a passive action that anyone can perform. It is quick and gets quicker with the development of digital technologies. We are immersed in a culture in which we arguably produce more images than the amount of images we can process. And yet we are lacking in political imagination. The question, I think, is not the amount of images we have around us, or whether they are real representations or digitally produced ones, but what we do with them. If, as you suggest, we need to think the imaginal in relation to different genealogies and different histories, always in plural, I want to suggest to think about seeing as also grounded in different genealogies and different histories. In order to do so, I want to problematize seeing in order to think about the consumption or engagement with imaginal as a multi-layered process of looking, seeing, visualizing, and imagining. The ways in which we intently listen to or look at have a deeply historical character, as Jonathan Crary have shown. And we could add that they also have a political character following the work of Nicholas Mirzoeff, or a gender character following the work of Laura Melville. What I want to argue is that seeing itself is layered and needs to be understood critically. I can listen to music while driving without hearing it or paying attention to the words or the lyrics of the music. Similarly, I can look at an image without seeing what is in it, and I can look at a photograph, seeing it only through the caption that frames it, or through the archive that catalogs it. In the same way, I can have the idea of an image or a sense of an image without the ability to visualize it or imagine it. My point is that we need to practice a multi-layer visual literacy and learn critical seeing in order to foreground critical imagining. Now, the theory of the imaginal is something you developed in your previous work, and it's deeply interrelated, I think, to the concept of the trans-individual, which you develop in your dialogue with Spinoza. I find this concept fascinating because it understands human beings as processes. Individuals, you write, are not given entities, but rather processes, webs of affective and imaginal relations, which are never given once and for all. Bodies are always necessarily bodies in plural, both social and individual at the same time, because their individuality is always and inevitably a form of trans-individuality that entails others, non-humans, animals, plants, air, water, and earth itself as part of our individuality. Now, I find, as I said, this notion fascinating because I think it helps us to ground the imaginal in specific bodies, specific places, and specific struggles. The trans-individuality of bodies is different, of course, in different places. When we live in a place with polluted water, for example, or without water at all, it affects our bodies and minds, as well as the bodies of the animals we share our place with and the plants around us. But also it affects our ability to think and to imagine. I wonder also if we could stretch a bit the idea of the trans-individual to include not only what is around us, but to include past and future generations. Part of what moves us in the world, the scars and desires, hopes and dreams, are inscribed in our bodies by memories and traumas of past generations. And I think that part, for many of us, activists and scholars thinking about political imagination, part of what moves us in our anxiety is our anxiety about future generations. So the theory of the imaginal, together with the theory of the trans-individual, I think offer a theory of care for each other and for what is in between us and for the world. Thank you.